The tide never reached this wall, so who left those marks above of where I slept?
Nora Vale left the county office with a paper bag of clothes under one arm and a blue appointment card bent soft in her fist. The woman behind the desk had used a careful voice, the kind people used when they had already decided the answer and wanted the refusal to sound clean. The restaurant job had gone to someone else because Nora's housing address had expired before payroll could verify it. Her bed at the transitional house had been given away that morning because the program counted absence by nights, not reasons. She stood under the shallow awning while rain stitched the parking lot silver. At 19, she had learned how to make herself small in rooms where people discussed her as a problem. She knew where to sign, when to nod, how not to cry in front of a plastic partition. But she had not learned where to go when all the polite doors closed on the same day. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. By late afternoon, Nora had walked past the last gas station on the inlet road with her canvas duffel dragging hard against her shoulder. Her phone showed 4% battery and no service. A pickup slowed once, tires hissing through the shoulder water, then went on. She was glad and not glad at the same time. The rain had gotten through the seams of her thrift store coat and turned the cuffs cold against her wrists. The road narrowed after the bait shop and began to run beside flat, dark water. Marsh grass leaned in one direction as if the whole shore had been combed by wind. A rusted sign rose from a tangle of yaupon and blackberry cane. Brackett's Landing Ferry, the lower half eaten by orange corrosion. Beneath it, an arrow pointed toward a gravel track that looked abandoned but not impassable. Nora followed it because shelter did not need to be good. It only needed a roof that held until morning. The ferry office appeared through rain and brackish fog as a low rectangle of cypress boards gray as driftwood, with a tin roof buckled near the front corner. A ticket window faced the road, its glass cracked in a white star. Beyond it, a dock reached into the inlet on pilings dark with rot, and a square freight shed sagged against the office like a tired shoulder. The building had the particular silence of a place people had stopped expecting to return to. Nora stopped at the threshold and listened. No voices, no engine, no dog barking from a nearby porch, just rain ticking on tin and the soft clack of something loose down by the water. The door was not locked. It hung inward from one hinge, swollen at the bottom where water had chewed the wood. Nora pushed it with 2 fingers and waited for the floor to answer. One board dipped under her boot, so she shifted her weight to the wall side and stepped carefully. She had lived in enough temporary places to respect a weak floor. You did not trust what looked solid until it held twice. Inside, the ferry office smelled of salt mildew and paper gone soft. A long counter divided the front room from the keeper's side. Behind it were shelves with curled schedule cards, a rusted cash drawer, and a stool lying on its side. Oyster shells had blown or been carried under the door and settled in the corners like broken teeth. A faded route map still hung above the counter, showing a dotted line across the inlet to a landing whose name had been bleached almost away. Nora set her duffel on the counter instead of the floor. She tested the back room and found it worse, a freight scale with a cracked dial roof. Water dripping through a seam and a dark stain spreading down the wall below it. She returned to the front where the counter made a narrow pocket of space invisible from the road. It was not safe exactly. It was less exposed. Her hands shook when she took out the last granola bar from her bag. She ate half and folded the wrapper over the rest. The simple act of saving food made her feel steadier. Outside, the inlet wind pressed rain against the ticket window until the cracked glass trembled. She tried her phone once, angling it toward the door. No service. 2%. There was one name she could call if the signal came back, Mrs. Alvarez, the caseworker, who had once sat with her through a court appointment and had never called her sweetheart. Nora looked at the blank service bars until the screen dimmed. Then she turned the phone off. Needing help was one thing. Becoming another emergency on someone's evening was another. Dark arrived early under the storm. Nora pulled 2 ferry schedules from the floor, shook off grit, and laid them over the driest boards behind the counter. She used her duffel as a pillow and kept her boots on. Every few minutes, a loose sound came from outside again, tap, pause, tap, tap. It was not close enough to be the door, not steady enough to be rain. She slept in pieces. Each time she woke, the building had changed its voice. The roof clicked as the temperature dropped. Water ran somewhere behind a wall. The dock gave a long wooden groan, answered by that small tapping from the inlet side. Just before dawn, Nora opened her eyes to a pale stripe of light under the ticket window. For a moment she did not remember where she was. Then the smell of salt paper and wet cypress brought the room back around her. The tapping came again, sharper now. She rose too quickly and caught the counter edge as one knee complained. Through the side window she saw the source a bell fixed to a short post at the head of the dock. Its rope had frayed loose and was flicking in the wind, nudging the clapper against the iron lip. No hand, no warning, only weather using what people had left behind. Nora almost laughed, but the sound stayed in her throat. The tide had fallen during the night. Mud showed around the pilings, slick and ribbed. Whatever water had come up in the storm had not reached the office steps. That was when she noticed the wall. Behind the counter, above the place where her head had rested, dark, horizontal lines crossed the cypress planks. They were not like the roof stain in the freight room. These were narrow and deliberate, stacked at uneven heights from knee level to above her shoulder. The lowest line had feathered edges, but the higher ones were straight, as if drawn with a level. Nora touched one. Her fingertip came away dusty, not wet. She turned toward the open door and looked outside again. The yard sloped down to the dock. The highest rack line of grass and reed lay below the rear step. The inlet had not entered this room last night, maybe not for years. Still the marks were there. Nora found a rag under the counter, stiff with age, and rubbed at the nearest plank. Mildew loosened in gray streaks. Beneath it, pencil marks appeared faint, but arranged beside the dark line. Not numbers at first. Not a date she could read. She leaned closer, holding her breath against the sour smell rising from the wall. CLARA. Nora wiped harder, careful not to splinter the raised grain. The last name emerged more slowly, tucked under the tide mark, as though someone had written it where only a person standing behind the ticket counter would notice. Wren. Outside, the dock bell tapped once in the wind and went still. Nora stood with the rag in her hand, rainwater drying cold in her sleeves, staring at a name the building had kept above the reach of the tide. Nora did not touch the name again until daylight had filled the room enough to make the shadows honest. She folded the rag over one finger and cleaned around the letters instead of across them. The pencil had sunk into the cypress grain, thin and stubborn, protected by whatever film the years had laid over it. Clara Wren remained when the mildew lifted. The tide line above her remained too. Nora found 3 more marks before the sun came clear of the cloud bank. One ran behind cracked route map. One crossed the ticket shelf at a height that would have soaked every paper in the room if it had been true floodwater. The highest mark disappeared behind a wooden board painted with ferry rates, foot, passenger, child, bicycle, freight, by weight. The paint had blistered, but the old black letters still held their shape. Her phone was dead now. She put it in her coat pocket and stepped outside. The storm had left the landing raw. Marsh grass lay flattened in silver-green mats. The gravel road held puddles the color of tea. Beside the office, the freight shed had shed a strip of roofing that now curled in the mud like a torn can lid. Nora walked toward the dock because she needed to know how far the water had come. The first boards were gray and soft at the edges. The third had split through one nail line. She stopped before putting her full weight on it. Below, the tide had pulled away from the pilings and left a lace of foam along the mud. The high-water trash line sat below the bottom step, reads a plastic bottle, a crab pot tag, 2 leaves plastered together. Nothing touched the office wall. The bell at the dockhead moved once in the wind. Nora looked back at the building. From outside, it was only abandoned, warped siding, cracked window tin roof, dull under a clearing sky. From inside, it had become something else, not haunted. Nora did not believe in that, but watched maybe, measured. She was standing with one boot on the rear step when the truck came up the gravel track. It was an old white pickup with a bait tank in the bed and a hand-painted door sign. Haskell, live bait and icy. The woman driving stopped hard enough that gravel clicked under the tires. She got out without shutting the door. She was in her 50s, broad through the shoulders with cropped gray hair flattened on one side from a knit cap. In one hand she carried a ring of keys heavy enough to serve as a warning. "You need to come away from that dock," the woman called. "That thing'll drop you before you know it's made up its mind." Nora stepped back at once. "I wasn't going farther. You staying in there?" The question landed like an accusation because it was one. Nora wiped her palms on her coat. "Just last night the door was open. That doesn't make it yours." "I know." The woman looked at the duffel visible through the doorway, then at Nora's wet cuffs, then at the dock. Her face did not soften, but her grip changed on the keys. "You break anything?" "No." "Take anything?" "No." "You got anybody coming?" Nora almost said yes because it would have made her easier to dismiss. Instead, she looked toward the road where no one was coming, and nothing in her life had become simpler overnight. "No." The woman exhaled through her nose. "I'm June Haskell. My shop's back by the main road. County asked me to keep an eye out since kids started daring each other to climb the roof." She pointed with the keys toward the dock. "One boy put a foot through that freight shed floor in August. His mama still glares at me like I built the place." Nora nodded. She could feel herself slipping into the tone she used with officials agreeable small, ready to leave before being told twice. But the wall behind the counter pulled at her. So did the broken dock board under June's gesture. "The third board is split through the fasteners," Nora said, "and there's a roof seam open over the freight scale. Water's getting behind the wall on that side. If somebody goes in after dark, they'll think the front room is the dangerous part, but the back room's worse." June stared at her a moment longer. "You a carpenter?" "No. I cleaned rentals with a maintenance crew one summer. Mostly after bad tenants. You learn what rot sounds like." "What's rot sound like?" Nora tapped the step rail with two knuckles. The outer strip answered dull and soft. Then she tapped closer to the wall where the wood gave a dry, higher note. "Different." June gave a reluctant glance at the rail. "Huh." She followed Nora inside but stayed near the door until Nora pointed out the dipping board. June shifted her weight, avoiding it without being told again. The room looked smaller with another person in it. Nora became aware of the folded schedules on the floor behind the counter, the half granola bar in her pocket, the shame of having used a public ruin as a bedroom. June saw the wall instead. "What did you do there?" "Cleaned it. Just that one spot." June stepped closer to the tide marks. Her keys stopped moving. "Clara Wren." "You know her?" "No." June said it too quickly, then corrected herself. "Know the name, maybe. Wren's a county name. Inland some. But I don't know a Clara." "The water didn't get this high last night," Nora said. "Water hasn't been inside this office since the hurricane in '96, far as I know. And that was floor level, not up there." Nora pointed to the rate board. "There are more lines behind that." June leaned in without touching it. The ferry rates were painted in columns, each fair paired with a row of small brass pegs. Some were missing. Some sat proud of the wood greened at the edges. "I used to come down here with my dad after the bridge opened," she said. "He'd complain about county waste and then sit on that bench for an hour. I don't remember those pegs. What were they for? Tickets, maybe. Schedule tags. I was 8. I cared about bottled soda and whether I could throw oyster shells farther than my brother." The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, June took out her phone, stepped to the doorway for signal and made 2 calls. Nora caught pieces. County review. Trespass, maybe not. Hazards. Somebody ought to document before demolition. Know today if possible while the road was already blocked. When June came back, she was frowning in a way that seemed aimed at the situation rather than Nora. "The county's got this place on a demolition review list. Not tomorrow. Soon enough. Clerk says if I can get photographs of hazards and anything historic looking, they'll add it to the file. They won't pay much. I wasn't asking for money." "I didn't say you were." June looked at the duffel again. "But if you work, you get paid. I can run it through the shop as cleanup help today and tomorrow. After that, we see what the clerk says. Nora did not answer fast. Offers often came with strings that appeared later tied tight around the part of you that had said yes. June seemed to understand enough not to decorate it. Day rate, June said. Trash bags, gloves, photos. You don't sleep on rotten floors without telling somebody where you are. You don't go on the dock. You don't pry anything old off the wall just because it looks interesting. Nora looked at Clara Wren's name. What if the interesting thing is why the wall looks like that? Then we take pictures first. By noon, Nora had gloves, a broom, contractor bags, and a cheese sandwich from the bait shop cooler that June pretended was too close to its sell-by date to charge for. They began with glass and loose metal. Nora carried trash to the truck bed and stacked anything that looked original on a dry tarp, schedule cards, 2 rusted ticket punches, a warped sign reading, "Wait for keeper," a ledger shelf with mouse-chewed corners but hand-cut joints. Work steadied her. It gave each minute a task and each task an edge. Sweep grit away from the counter. Photograph before moving. Keep old paper flat. Mark bad boards with orange tape. Drink water before her hands started shaking. In the late afternoon, with the front room cleared enough to breathe, Nora knelt behind the ticket counter and studied the rate board. The brass pegs were not arranged evenly. Some lined up with fare categories, but others sat just beside them as if marking something that mattered more than price. She held a flashlight low across the wood. Shadows lifted around tiny penciled notches. "June," she said. June came in carrying a roll of tape. "If that's another snakeskin, I don't need to see it." "It isn't." Nora pointed. "These pegs match the lines. Not all of them, just these." June crouched slowly, one hand on the counter. Nora touched the lowest dark tide mark, then the brass peg beside child. The height matched. She moved to the next line and found another peg beside foot passenger. The third sat near freight by weight, but lower than the painted words, as though someone had cared about the placement more than the label, had loosened the grime. "C. Wren." June was quiet for a long moment. Outside the inlet, wind moved under the dock and made the loose bell rope whisper against the post. "Pictures first," June said, but her voice had changed. Nora lifted the camera phone June had loaned her and framed the board, the pegs, the tide mark, and the small, carved name together. For the first time since she had stepped off the county office curb, she felt the day open in front of her instead of closing behind. The next morning, June unlocked the Ferry office before opening the bait shop. She brought coffee in a paper cup, a clipboard, and a yellow rain jacket with a tear under one sleeve. Nora arrived 10 minutes later from the bench outside Haskell Live Bait, where June had let her sit after closing but not sleep. The distinction had been spoken kindly enough to make Nora obey it. The storm had passed, leaving the inlet sharp and bright under a cold sky. Every wet surface seemed to hold light: the gravel, the marsh grass, the tin roof, the black mud showing beneath the dock. Nora stepped inside and felt at once how different the office seemed in clean weather. Yesterday, it had been a shelter. Now, it was a question with walls around it. June set the coffee on the counter. "No prying. I know. No unscrewing. I know. No heroic nonsense if the floor shifts." Nora looked at the orange tape they had laid across the weak boards. "You have a lot of categories. I've known a lot of fools." They began by photographing the room again from Fixed Point's doorway, ticket window, counter, freight shed threshold. June said the county clerk liked things that looked orderly. Nora wrote the photo numbers on a sheet of cardboard and sketched the tide marks with a borrowed pencil. The lines were not evenly spaced, but they were clean enough to measure. She marked their heights from the floor with a tape measure, then compared them to the exterior tide board beside the rear stairs. That was where the first certainty failed. The exterior board was carved with feet and half feet, the numbers softened by weather but readable. The storm's rack line outside matched the lower marks on the board. The interior lines did not. Even the lowest line behind the counter sat too high. The highest would have required water deep enough to float the cash drawer, lift the schedules, and leave debris in the shelves. Nothing in the room showed that kind of violence. The curled papers were stained by humidity, not by being submerged. The dust behind the counter had lain where dust would lie if no tide had ever reached it. Nora held the tape measure against the rate board and frowned. What June asked. The marks don't measure like water. June stepped over the taped floor line and stood beside her. Then, what do they measure like? Nora looked from the brass pegs to the penciled notches along the paint. Like someone used the idea of water to remember something else. June did not answer, but she stayed. In the freight shed. Nora found a flat metal box under the broken scale platform. It had rusted shut at one corner, and when June opened it with patient taps from a screwdriver handle, they found old receipt books inside wrapped in waxed butcher paper. The top book was ruined along the edge. The second had survived better. Its cover read, Brackett's Landing Crossings Octane Deck, 1954. Nora carried it to the front counter as if it were something alive and easily hurt. The paper smelled dry and mineral like attic dust mixed with salt. She did not turn pages quickly. Each sheet had columns ruled by hand-date fare passenger freight paid remarks. Most entries were plain. Names, cents, sacks of cornmeal, bicycle, 1 goat, 2 crates, mail pouch. Then, on October 17, she saw the first small mark that matched the wall. It was not a drawing of a tide line. It was a short, horizontal stroke in the remarks column placed beside a passenger whose fare had not been written in the paid column. Nora checked the date against the schedule cards. October 17th had an extra evening crossing penciled in below the printed times. She found the corresponding brass peg beside foot passenger green around its head. She forgot her coffee. She forgot the cold in her hands. They built the pattern slowly because anything worth believing needed to survive more than excitement. Nora made 3 columns on cardboard wall height peg position receipt date. June read dates aloud from the receipt book. Nora matched them to the schedule cards and then to the interior marks. Not every unpaid fare had a line. Not every line had a clear entry, but enough did. November 2, extra crossing after dark. 2 passengers. Paid column blank. Remarks carried anyway. November 9, child fare. Paid column blank. Initials only. Remarks carried anyway. November 16, freight by weight. 1 crate medicine. Paid column blank. Remarks carried anyway. June read that one twice, quieter the second time. Medicine for who, Nora asked. Book doesn't say. The name, Clara, Wren appeared first as C. Wren, then Clara W., then in full on a page where the ink had bled at the corner but left the center clean. She had crossed at night more than once, sometimes with a child fare beside hers, sometimes with no fare at all. Once, the remarks column held only 3 words in a firm, slanted hand. No charge, storm. Nora sat back on her heels. Why hide it in marks? Maybe he didn't want someone reading the book. Then why write it at all? June looked toward the ticket window where the inlet flashed between cracked glass. Some people can't let a thing happen unless they put it somewhere. That was close enough to something inside Nora that she looked down. Her own life had been kept in folders she never got to hold intake forms. Absence reports, case notes, eligibility letters. Records could follow you like a stain. Records could also prove you had been there when someone wanted to say you had not. She turned a page and found a penciled symbol beside Clara's name. 3 small dots stacked like the heads of brass pegs. The same symbol appeared at the edge of the rate board, almost invisible under blistered paint. June saw where she was looking. No, I'm not prying. That sentence usually comes right before prying. I'm comparing. Nora took a fresh photograph, then ran her finger in the air over the 3-dot symbol without touching the board. 1 brass peg near child sat slightly proud. Another, beside foot passenger, had a crescent of cleaner wood around it as if it had been moved many times before it froze in place. The third was not in a fare row at all. It sat low near the bottom trim. June went outside to call the clerk. Nora heard her voice through the broken ticket window, firm and irritated. Historic materials. Possible records. No, not kids. No, not vandals. Yes, she understood liability. While June argued, Nora knelt and examined the lowest peg. It had a slot across its head, not for a screwdriver exactly, but for a coin or ticket punch edge. She did not move it. She only brushed away grit around it with a dry paintbrush June had bought that morning. The peg turned under the brush. Not far. Barely enough to make a soft click inside the wood. Nora froze. The rate board shifted forward a fraction of an inch. June came back in mid-sentence and stopped. Tell me that was the building settling. I brushed it. You brushed it. With a paintbrush. That's your defense. Nora pointed to the gap, now showing as a black hairline along the left edge of the board. It moved. June closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them, and took the paintbrush from Nora's hand. Found Trouble said that first. They did not touch it again for nearly an hour. June called the county clerk, who called someone at the local historical society, who called a man named Leonard Bell. While they waited, Nora cleaned the floor around the counter. Not because it needed cleaning then, but because her hands needed work that would not change anything important. June put a strip of painter's tape across the shifted edge of the board and wrote, "Do not pull in block letters." Mr. Bell arrived in a tan sedan that looked too clean for the gravel road. He was narrow, careful, and dressed in a brown cardigan under a canvas coat. His hair had gone white at the temples, but not thin, and he carried a plastic crate packed with gloves, acid-free. The next morning, Nora arrived before June unlocked the bait shop. Fog sat low over the inlet, turning the dock pilings into dark posts with no visible bottom. She waited on the gravel with a paper cup of gas station coffee, warming both hands watching the ferry office appear and disappear in the pale weather. Its roofline looked smaller in calm air. Less like shelter now, more like a question left where a road ended. June came down the track with a plastic crate of supplies and a look that said she had not slept well. Clerk found 2 old survey sheets, she said, setting the crate on the ticket counter. Nothing useful. One says ferry office, one says storage. County records have a talent for saying a thing exists without admitting anybody used it. Nora took out the photographs from yesterday, printed on June's shop printer, with faint lines across the ink. She had arranged them in order on a piece of cardboard exterior, tide board interior, wall marks rate board, pegs carved initials, the high water trash line below the rear step. "I want to compare heights," she said. June looked at the coffee in Nora's hand, then at the cardboard. "You always this cheerful in the morning?" "No." That made June give a small sound that was almost a laugh. She handed Nora a tape measure, blue painter's tape, and a carpenter's pencil. No prying. No climbing. No dock. They began outside where the tide board stood beside the rear stairs on 2 iron straps gone red with rust. Its painted numbers had faded, but the notches cut into the wood were still readable by touch. Nora held the tape while June called out measurements from the bottom of the lowest step. 32 inches, 41, 57, 63.5. Nora marked each number on the cardboard and kept glancing toward the interior wall as if the building might change its marks while she was not looking. Inside, the air felt colder. The ferry office had dried only on the surface. Salt kept its own dampness in the boards. Nora measured the first dark line behind the counter, 41 inches from the floor. The second, 57. The highest visible line disappeared behind the rate board at just over 63. June stopped writing. Same as outside. Same as the tide board, Nora said, but not last night's water. Could be from the hurricane. Then why are they so straight behind the counter? And why do they stop where the rate board begins? June did not answer. She went to the doorway and looked at the inlet, her hands braced on her hips. Nora knew that posture. It was the shape adults took when they wanted the world to become ordinary again. They spent the next hour finding what the building would give without being forced. In a drawer, swollen almost shut, Nora found a brittle receipt book wrapped in a feed sack. The pages had warped into waves. June wanted to lift it by the covers, but Nora slid a sheet of cardboard underneath, first the way Mr. Lowe on the maintenance crew had taught her to move broken window glass support the whole thing, not the part that looked strongest. The receipt book was mostly fares. Names when someone had an account. Numbers when someone did not. The ink had browned to the color of weak tea. Nora turned pages with the corner of an envelope and saw dates scattered across the top. Top, October 1948, March 1952, August 1955. Some crossings had neat amounts beside them. Others had a dash, then a small mark like a wave. June leaned closer. That can't be money. No. What is it? Nora checked the wall again. 41 inches. On the receipt page dated October 12, 1952, 3 fare lines carried the same little wave mark. The ferry had run 6 times that night instead of 2. She flipped carefully to another storm date printed in the old newspaper clipping taped inside the drawer, September 19, 1955. Gale warning posted at Belhaven. The receipt page showed extra crossings after dark and the same wave mark. Each time the ferry ran beyond its schedule, one brass peg on the rate board seemed to answer it. Nora forgot the cold in her sleeves. She made a column in pencil date tied notch peg position receipt mark. The pattern came slowly, then all at once. The pegs were not prices. They were memory pins. Someone had moved or set them to match high water on nights when the ferry carried people anyway. June watched her build the pattern without interrupting. Finally, she said, "That's a lot to read into old scratches." "I know." Nora's voice stayed low. "But scratches don't line up with storm crossings by accident." She touched one brass peg with the tip of her pencil. It shifted. Both women went still. Nora drew her hand back. The peg had not fallen loose. It had turned a fraction in its hole, and somewhere behind the rate board wood made a small dry click. June said, "Don't." "I'm not." But Nora had already seen the problem differently. The pegs were not simply markers. At least one was a part of the board. They photographed every inch before touching anything else. June called the clerk who called someone at the county archive who promised to send the only man around here who gets excited about moldy paper. While they waited, Nora sat on the floor behind the counter with her coat folded under her knees and studied the peg heads. Some were round and plain. 4 had a tiny filed flat along one side. The flats pointed in different directions. She turned the first one back to where it had been, then stopped. The click reversed. "Show me," June said. Nora pointed to the tide measurements written on cardboard. "If these match the notches outside, maybe the pegs have to match the waterline order. Lowest to highest. Maybe the whole board drops on your hand. Maybe." So we wait. Waiting was harder than working. Nora swept the same patch of floor twice. She carried the receipt book to the driest shelf, and then carried it back because the shelf looked too close to the stained wall. Outside, the fog lifted and showed the opposite bank as a dark strip of pine. The bridge sat far inland, a low gray line built after the ferry stopped mattering. Near noon, a compact car came down the track and parked behind June's truck. The man who stepped out wore a brown canvas jacket, rubber boots too clean for the landing, and a knit cap folded with exact care. He introduced himself as Daniel Bell from the county archive, then put on nitrile gloves before shaking anyone's hand. "Please tell me nobody has made a dramatic discovery with a screwdriver," he said. June pointed at Nora. She made a quiet discovery with a tape measure. Mr. Bell accepted this with visible relief. He listened while Nora explained the measurements. He asked her to repeat the part about the storm dates. He did not praise her, which she appreciated. Praise made her feel like a child being rewarded for neat handwriting. Instead, he took out a notebook and began writing down what she had done. "That is good procedure," he said. "Not proof yet, but good procedure." He examined the rate board with a small flashlight, angling the beam until the blistered paint threw shadows. "This board has been removed before. See the screw heads not original to the wall. But these side battens are older." He leaned closer. "And these pegs are not random. They pass through." Through to what June asked, a question we should not answer quickly. Mr. Bell had Nora photograph the board again with a ruler in every frame. Then he had June hold the flashlight, while he used no tool at all, only 2 gloved fingers to test the loosened peg. He turned it a quarter rotation. The dry click sounded again. He turned a second peg, then stopped and looked at Nora's cardboard. "You said lowest to highest." Nora nodded. "Then you tell me the order." Her mouth went dry. It was one thing to puzzle over marks when no one official was watching. It was another to become responsible for what happened next. She read the measurements aloud. 41, 57, 63.5. Mr. Bell turned each corresponding peg so the filed flat faced upward. At the last one, the rate board shifted forward less than half an inch. Dust fell in a soft line onto the counter. No one spoke. Mr. Bell did not pull the board. He slid a thin inspection mirror into the opening and aimed his flashlight through the gap. Nora smelled something different then under mildew and salt dry. Paper tar, the closed-in breath of a place that had not been opened in decades. "There is a cavity," he said, narrow, lined, deliberate. June crossed her arms tightly. "For money." Mr. Bell gave her a tired look. People hide many things more troublesome than money. He eased the board forward another inch, enough to show black tar paper folded around a rectangular bundle. The space behind it was no wider than a bookcase turned sideways. It had been built between studs protected by the rate board in front and the exterior tide board behind. A person could have stood in this room every day for 50 years and never known it was there. Nora thought of sleeping beneath it, of rain on tin, of Clara Wren's name inches above her shoulder while she had tried to disappear from her own life for one night. Mr. Bell stopped again. "We need a cleaner surface." June cleared the counter with quick practical motions. Nora spread the lease-stained schedule cards underneath a sheet of brown paper from June's crate. Mr. Bell approved with a nod and then slowly drew the bundle out. It was wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff at the folds and tied with cotton tape. Not a box. Not a treasured chest. Just a packet about the size of a church hymnal, darkened at the corners light enough that Mr. Bell held it with both hands anyway. A small paper tag had been tied into the knot, its writing faded but legible. "Landy accounts do not post," June whispered. "What does that mean?" Mr. Bell did not answer until he had opened the first fold of oilcloth. Inside lay a ledger with a brown cover, its spine cracked but intact, and two smaller envelopes pressed flat beneath it. The ledger smelled of dust and old river air. Its first page had been ruled by hand. Mr. Bell turned it just enough for them to read without touching. Nora saw the columns: first date, weather crossing name, fair note. Then she saw the name halfway down the page, written in a careful hand that had resisted the years. Clara Wren. Beside it, where a fair should have been, there was no dollar amount. Only the small wave mark from the receipt book. In the note column, the ferry keeper had written 2 words, "Carried anyway." June put one hand flat on the counter as if the floor had shifted. Nora read the words again. They did not explain everything. They explained enough to make the room feel occupied by more than weather and rot. The ferry office had not been keeping a secret about riches. It had been keeping track of. Mr. Bell lowered the page carefully and looked toward the wall where the tide marks crossed the cypress planks like a ladder no one had climbed in years. "We stop here for today," he said. "This needs controlled drying, proper photographs, and no more brave ideas." Nora should have been disappointed. Instead, she felt the kind of caution that comes when something fragile has trusted you by accident. She stepped back from the counter and let Mr. Bell fold the oilcloth loosely around the ledger again. Outside, sunlight broke through the fog for the first time that day. It touched the dock bell, the broken ticket window, the tide board, and the wet gravel track leading back toward town. Nora stood behind the counter with her hands empty, watching the hidden packet rest on brown paper where tickets had once been sold. Mr. Bell would not let the ledger stay overnight in the ferry office. He wrapped it in clean, unbuffered paper from a flat archival box. He had brought in his trunk, then placed the oilcloth bundle inside as if it were injured rather than valuable. Nora watched every movement. The care seemed excessive until she saw how the ledger cover flexed when air reached it, lifting at the corners like a dry leaf. "Paper changes its mind when it comes out of hiding," Mr. Bell said. "Slow is the only kindness." June drove them to the bait shop because it had heat, a clean table, and a back room where no one would set a soda can on a county record by mistake. Nora sat with her coat still on hands tucked under her thighs to keep from touching anything. Outside the small window minnow, buckets knocked together in the wind. The river smell followed them in anyway, caught in Nora's sleeves and hair. Mr. Bell set a portable humidity gauge on the table, then opened the box. "We read only what the pages allow. No flattening, no forcing. If a page resists, the page wins." June leaned against the freezer with her arms crossed. "You talk about paper like it pays taxes. Paper outlives people who do," he said. The first pages were ordinary enough to feel almost disappointing. Dates, weather, the number of passengers, a calf carried across in a sling, 2 sacks of seed, a bicycle repaired with wire because the owner had to make the last crossing before dark. The handwriting belonged to someone patient. Even letters, practical notes, no decoration except a long downward stroke on the capital B in bracket. Then the pattern began. Beside certain names, the fare column held only the small wave mark. In the note column, the words changed slightly from page to page. Carried anyway. Settled by work. No posting. Widow with 2 boys. Mill hand hurt. School crossing North Bank. Clara. Wren appeared first in October, then twice in November, then through a winter that looked harsh even in ink. Her name was sometimes alone, sometimes followed by infant wrapped or medicine run. Once in January, Amos had written and beside her name walked from Pike Road in sleet. Nora kept her face still, but her hand had closed around the edge of her chair. She had never had a child. She had never crossed an inlet in sleet for medicine. Still, the sentence entered a place in her that recognized distance measured by need. June read over Mr. Bell's shoulder. Why write it down if he wasn't charging them? To remember accurately, Mr. Bell said, or to account for what others would question. He turned another page with a thin spatula. Near the middle of the ledger, an envelope had been sewn into the binding with dark thread. The flap was not sealed, only tucked. On the front, in the same steady hand, Amos Brackett had written, "If the landing is closed, and I am not here to answer." Mr. Bell sat back. This is the point where a sensible person stops and calls the county office. June looked at the dark window. And are we sensible people? I am deeply tiresome about procedure, which is better. He photographed the envelope in place, measured it, noted the thread, and then used small scissors to cut only the stitch that had already frayed loose. Nora held the flashlight without being asked. The beam trembled once. She steadied it against the table edge. The letter inside was 2 pages folded twice. The paper had browned where Amos's fingers must have pressed it shut. Mr. Bell opened it only halfway at first. When it did not crack, he eased the fold wider. He read aloud because the handwriting was old but clear, and because silence would have made the words too heavy. To whoever finds these accounts, I kept 2 books because one kind of truth can harm a person when placed in the wrong hands. June's expression changed at that. Nora saw it from the corner of her eye, the hard line of her mouth relaxing not into softness but attention. The letter named a creditor from the Old Mill Road, Harlan Pike, who had begun collecting unpaid ferry fares from people who already owed him for seed tools rent or medicine. Pike had come to the landing with a copy of posted debts and told Amos that any name carried without payment was proof of dishonesty. He wanted the list nailed beside the rate board where everyone waiting for the ferry would see who had crossed on credit. Amos refused. Pike threatened to report him for stealing fares from the ferry account. So Amos made a public book Mr. Bell read clean enough for men who think mercy is poor arithmetic. And I made this one for the truth. If a person crossed hungry, wet, grieving, carrying a child, carrying medicine, carrying news of death, or going toward work that might keep a roof over them, I mark the water instead of the debt. Nora looked toward the closed door of the bait shop back room. Beyond it, customers came and went buying ice bait cigarettes, coffee. Ordinary transactions. Ordinary names. She imagined a list nailed in public, each debt turning a crossing into a bruise. Mr. Bell continued. Clara, Wren is not to be posted. She crossed for honest reasons and more than once in weather that would have kept a better provided person at home. If anyone claims she owes this landing, let them claim it from me. The child she carried should not grow up with his mother's need made into town sport. June put one hand over her eyes and then lowered it, quickly annoyed at herself. Nora stared at the wave marks. She had seen records used as traps, missed appointments, expired addresses, warnings printed in red signatures. Proving she had understood rules no one explained well. Amos's ledger was still a record, but it had been built like a shelter. It kept the names from being erased without making them stand in the road to be judged. There are dozens, Nora said. Mr. Bell nodded. More than dozens if the later pages continue. Then Clara wasn't the secret. No, he said. She may be the name that survived on the wall because someone wanted one example remembered, or because Amos came back to it often. June moved from the freezer to the table. The county will call this interesting and still tear the place down. Possibly. And Mr. Bell removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth that looked too worn to clean anything well. A ledger does not make a building sound. Historical significance can delay demolition. It does not repair floor joists. Nora heard the sentence as a door closing, then forced herself to hear the whole of it. Delay was not denial. Soundness was not magic. A building that mattered could still fall down if water kept entering it. What would they need? She asked. June looked at her. Who? The county. To delay it. Mr. Bell folded the letter back along its old creases and rested his hands beside it. A condition report. Photographs. Proof the building's function connects directly to the records. A practical use that does not require pretending the dock is safe. Someone willing to help stabilize it enough that it is not just a liability with a good story. June gave a humorless laugh. That's a long list. Nora thought of the office in the rain, the open door, the wall above her head. She thought of Clara walking from Pike Road in sleet, an infant wrapped against her chest and a ferry keeper choosing not to turn her need into a public notice. Not as long as walking in sleet, Nora said. The back room went quiet. Mr. Bell looked at her for a moment, then wrote something in his notebook. They worked until closing. Mr. Bell photographed every readable page but did not turn past the section that resisted. June found an empty shelf away from the bait tanks where the archival box could sit until morning, locked behind the shop office door. Nora copied names onto a legal pad, one line at a time, not the whole ledger, not enough to claim understanding, just enough to begin. When June finally drove her back to the ferry office to collect her duffel, the inlet was dark and low. The building stood with no light inside. Its open doorway looked less like an invitation now and more like work waiting in bad weather. "You're not sleeping there tonight," June said. Nora braced for the shape of charity. June did not give it that shape. "There's a storage room over the shop with a cot and too many crab traps. You can use it while this county mess sorts itself out. In exchange, you show up tomorrow and help me put a tarp over that roof seam before more rain gets in." Nora looked at the ferry office. The tide board was only a darker line beside the rear stairs. She could not see. "All right," she said. She went inside for her duffel and paused behind the ticket counter. The rate board sat slightly forward from the wall, the hidden cavity dark and empty behind it. Without the ledger, the room should have felt stripped. Instead, for the first time, Nora understood the marks as instructions rather than stains. She picked up the carpenter's pencil from the counter and wrote one small word on the cardboard beneath the measurements. Protect. The first tarp went on badly. Nora learned this within 10 minutes, standing on the office side of the freight shed while cold rain worked under the blue plastic and found the same roof seam it had found before. June had brought a ladder, 2 sandbags, a roll of lath, and the expression of a woman who knew temporary repairs were mostly arguments with weather. Nora held the ladder from the ground because neither of them trusted the shed roof, and because June had said, "You are 19, not weightless." They did not try to make the building pretty. Mr. Bell had been clear that pretty could come later if later came at all. First came water. Water in the roof, water behind the wall, water under the threshold, water wicked into old paper dust and sleeping mold. Nora carried rotten trim to the truck bed marked soft floorboards with orange tape and used a screwdriver handle to test the lower wall studs by sound. The bad ones answered with a tired thud. June showed her how to tuck the tarp under the tin overlap instead of laying it like a blanket. Rain is nosy," she said. "Give it a loose edge and it'll move in." The second attempt held better. Water ran off the freight shed in a clean sheet and fell into the mud instead of the wall. Nora watched it for a full minute, waiting for the leak to reappear inside. It did not. That small success changed the room. The ferry office still smelled of mildew. The floor still dipped. The dock was still off limits, its first 3 boards striped with caution tape. But for the first time, one problem had been answered by work instead of worry. Nora wrote it in Mr. Bell's condition notebook, temporary tarp, installed over freight room roof seam. Active interior drip stopped at 11:42 a.m., monitor after next rain. Her handwriting looked steadier than she felt. Mr. Bell returned that afternoon with blotter paperweight, soft brushes, and a folding table he wiped down twice before allowing the ledger box near it. He set up in the front room because the bait shop back office had too much traffic, but he kept the ledger itself inside a sealed archival folder until the humidity gauge settled. Nora expected him to perform some delicate rescue that looked like magic. Instead, preservation was mostly patience. He opened one page as far as it wanted to open, slid dry blotter nearby, but not against fragile ink photographed, noted, waited. When a page curled, he let it curl. When a corner resisted, he stopped. "You don't win against paper," he told Nora. "You negotiate." She copied names while he worked. Clara Wren, Ruth Bellamy, Isaac Mott, Leona Price and Child, Joseph Vale. Her pencil stopped. The last name sat in the ledger between two ordinary crossings in March of 1954. Joseph Vale, North Bank, no fair mill injury, carried anyway. Nora knew Vale was not rare enough to mean anything by itself. She knew better than to build a family from one line in old ink. Still, the letters held her in place. She had never known much about her father's people. Her mother had kept 3 photographs, 2 addresses that stopped forwarding mail, and a way of changing the subject whenever Nora asked where the Vales had started. Mr. Bell noticed the pause but did not reach for drama common name. Maybe. Copy it as written. Meaning can wait. That became the rule for the whole afternoon. Copy first, feel later. Nora wrote each name with the care she had once used for job applications, but this time no line asked her to prove she deserved the space she occupied. The ledger did not ask whether Clara paid. It recorded that she crossed. It recorded that Joseph crossed. It recorded weather direction circumstance and the decision of a ferry keeper who had marked need with a wave instead of a debt. By dusk, Nora's hand ached. Mr. Bell let her place one clean blotter near the page edge under his direction. It was the smallest possible task, and she treated it as if the whole landing depended on it. Maybe it did. The county clerk wore reading glasses on a chain and had the brisk mercy of someone who processed too many emergencies to love any of them. Her name was Maribel Knox, and she met them at the ferry office 2 days later with a clipboard, mud boots, and a county maintenance man who refused to step past the threshold until Nora pointed out which boards held. "I appreciate the documentation," Maribel said, looking at Mr. Bell's preliminary notes. "But delay requires more than interesting records. The building has no active use, the dock is a hazard, and the budget is already spoken for." June made a sound in her throat. Nora kept her eyes on the clipboard. "It could have an active use," Nora said. Maribel looked up. "As what?" Nora had practiced the answer while sweeping grit from behind the counter. In practice, it sounded plain and sensible. In the room with the clerk waiting and the maintenance man glancing at his watch, the words came out thinner. A small archive stop. Not the dock, just the front office. The ledger connects to the rate board and the tide marks. People could see how the ferry worked. Storm shelter maybe later if the structure passed inspection. For now, documentation and stabilization. Who operates that? The question took the air from her. Nora looked at June, then Mr. Bell. She hated herself for doing it. She heard every version of her life that had trained her not to claim authority. Temporary address, expired paperwork, no degree, no family name, that mattered. June did not rescue her. She only shifted one boot against the floor, a small sound that brought Nora back to the room. "I can help," Nora said. "I'm already doing the condition notes. Mr. Bell is handling the records. June can coordinate local access through the shop. The county would still own it. We're asking for a delay, not a miracle." Maribel wrote something on the clipboard. Her face gave nothing away. A delay still requires a written stabilization plan. Water control, floor hazard mitigation. Pest and mold assessment, public access restrictions, proposed use and responsible contacts. 10 days. June said 10 days is tight. Demolition review is in 12. Nora felt the old panic rise, the kind that turned every deadline into proof she was already too late. Then she looked at the wall behind the counter, where the dark lines stood in patient order. Amos had not stopped Pike with a speech. He had kept 2 books. He had made a system small enough to survive. 10 days, Nora said. Maribel's eyes moved to her. "Put everything in writing. Photographs help. Measurements help more." When the clerk left, June stared at the empty doorway. Well, that was not a no. It wasn't a yes, no, June said, but a no usually travels faster. They began with the threshold because every person who entered crossed it, and because Nora could fix part of it without pretending to be a carpenter. June brought a pry bar and 2 lengths of treated lumber from behind the bait shop. The original sill was too far gone at one end, soft enough that Nora could press a screwdriver into it and leave a dark crescent. Don't tear out what you don't understand, June said. Expose photograph brace, then replace only what's failed. Nora took pictures before each step. She labeled them in a notebook: front threshold, east end ROT, hinge aside jamb lower 6 inches soft, floorboard 3 unsafe, temporary brace installed. The work was slow because they stopped often to compare what they saw with what the building needed. Nora had spent years moving through places where repairs were cosmetic paint over water stains, rug over weak flooring, air freshener over mold. This was different. This was admitting damage by name. Mr. Bell came by near noon with copies of ledger pages sealed in plastic sleeves. He did not bring the original. He tacked nothing to the wall. Instead, he laid 1 copy on the counter and weighted it with 2 clean stones from June's truck. Your plan needs to show why the building matters as a Ferry office, he said, not as a sad old room. Board, tideboard, ledger cavity, and landing approach all work together. Lose that connection and the story becomes portable. Portable stories do not save buildings. Nora wrote that down too, though she shortened it to function-ties records to place, swept the sill clean, and stood back while June tested it twice with her boot. Good enough to keep rain from being invited, June said. After June drove back to the shop for more screws, Nora remained alone in the Ferry office for a few minutes. The room had a temporary tarp overhead, orange tape on its wounds, copied names on the counter, and a door that could close. It was not saved. It was not even safe. But it had crossed some narrow line between ruin and responsibility. Nora lifted the latch and pulled the door shut from inside. The sound was small wood meeting wood, not quite square but willing. She rested her palm against the patched threshold and felt the wind press from the other side without entering. The nor'easter arrived before the plan was finished. By noon, rain had thickened into gray ropes across the inlet, and the wind came low enough to push water over the first dock boards. June wanted to wait it out from the bait shop, but Nora kept watching the weather radar on June's office computer and thinking of the tarp edge, the freight room wall, the open cavity behind the rate board. We check from the road, June said. We do not become news. They drove down with hazard-tape sandbags and a flashlight even though it was daytime. The Ferry office stood in blown rain, the patched threshold holding the blue tarp snapping, but still seated under the tin. Nora felt a fierce, unreasonable gratitude toward a sheet of plastic. Inside water had seeped under one corner, but had not reached the counter. They lifted the copied ledger pages into a plastic bin and moved the condition notebook to the highest shelf. Nora checked the wall behind the rate board, then the tide board outside from the safety of the steps. The inlet had risen fast, swallowing the mud and licking at the lower pilings. A shelf in the freight room had fallen. It lay face down below the old scale, spilling rusted hooks and a cracked lantern chimney across the floor. Behind where it had hung the wall showed another dark line lower than the others, but sharper marked beside 3 small nail holes in a triangle. Nora crouched without touching it. The line did not match the visible peg sequence. It pointed toward the freight scale, not the ticket counter. June saw her looking. No brave ideas in a storm. No, Nora said, pictures first. She took 6 photographs while rain beat the tin roof hard enough to make conversation thin. In the last flash, something brass glimmered through a split in the baseboard below the fallen shelf. They waited until the next morning. Waiting had become part of the work, though Nora still disliked it. When the wind dropped and the tide pulled back, Mr. Bell came with gloves and the same tired patience. The freight room baseboard was already broken at one end, so he allowed June to remove only the loose section, while Nora held a dustpan beneath it. Behind the board was a space too shallow for a ledger packed with mouse-chewed cloth and silt. Inside the cloth lay brass Ferry tokens. They were smaller than quarters, darkened at the edges, each stamped not with money but initials. CWRBIJV. Some had holes punched near the rim as if they had once been tied to string. Nora picked up none of them. She only read what the light gave her. Mr. Bell placed them on a padded tray. Passage tokens, he said. Private system, maybe. Proof someone had been counted without being charged. June leaned over the tray. Or proof Amos was hiding fares. I was hiding people from fares, Nora said. No one corrected her. The tokens changed the plan. The ledger showed names. The rate board showed the ferry's public face. The tide marks showed storm crossings. The tokens showed a method away for Amos to give passage without making a person ask twice. Nora added them to the condition report as linked artifacts, then wrote a plain sentence beneath the photographs. These objects only make full sense inside the ferry office where the rate board, tide board, hidden cavity, and landing route remain together. That evening alone at June's kitchen table above the bait shop, Nora looked again at the token marked JV. She did not claim it. She did not build a father from brass. But she let herself imagine that one of her people, however distant, had once been carried across dark water by someone who chose not to make shame the price of help. The demolition review took place in a county meeting room with beige walls, bad coffee, and a framed map of roads that made the old ferry route look like a mistake. Nora wore one of her work shirts washed clean and the boots she had scrubbed twice. June sat beside her with a folder thick enough to defend itself. Mr. Bell sat on the other side archival box, at his feet original ledger left safely behind. Maribel Knox opened the file. Brackett's Landing Ferry Office. Structure review and demolition recommendation. Nora felt every face turned toward the table. She had written her notes in order: water control, floor hazards, public access restrictions, historical function, proposed use. Still, when Maribel invited comment, the first words stuck. June slid one photograph closer to her. It showed the rate board, the tide mark, and Clara Wren's name in the same frame. Nora began there. She did not make a speech about destiny. She described the building. Cypress plank walls, tin roof with temporary water control, freight room seams stabilized, front threshold repaired enough to secure the door, dock closed as unsafe, front room usable only by appointment after floor bracing. She showed the tide board measurements and the matching interior marks. She explained the brass pegs, the hidden ledger cavity, and the tokens without touching the originals. Then she read one line from the copied ledger: Clara Wren medicine run carried anyway. The room stayed quiet. This is not a request to reopen the dock, Nora said. It is not a request for a museum budget. It is a request for a delay long enough to stabilize the ferry office as a small local history stop and protected record site. The story is not portable without the building. The building explains why the records were hidden and why the names mattered. A man at the end of the table asked who would maintain it. Nora looked at her page. I will continue, condition notes, and controlled cleanup under county permission. June Haskell will coordinate access through the bait shop. Mr. Bell will supervise records handling. Public entry stays restricted until floor hazards are addressed. We have a 90-day work list. Her voice did not fail this time. It shook once, then held. The county did not save the ferry office that day. Nora learned to distrust words that sounded complete. What they granted was smaller and more useful. A 90-day demolition delay, a limited caretaker agreement permission to remove non-historic debris, temporary weatherproofing approval, and an archive assessment through Mr. Bell's office. The dock remained closed. The freight shed remained restricted. The ferry office was not safe for visitors, not yet. June read the decision twice in the parking lot. That is a yes wearing county shoes. Nora looked at the paper until the signatures steadied. Her name appeared under temporary caretaker contact. Not resident, not owner, not emergency placement, contact. At the ferry office, she unlocked the patch door with a key that still stuck in the old cylinder. The room smelled cold and damp, but not abandoned. She set a copied ledger page in a sleeve on the counter, then took out an archival card Mr. Bell had given her for practice. On the first line she wrote Clara Wren. She did not add more. The name was enough for the card to begin. By early winter, Brackett's Landing still looked weathered from the road. The tin roof kept its uneven shine. The dock still carried warning tape. Moss held the shaded side of the freight shed, and the old ferry sign at the gravel track leaned no straighter than before. Nothing about the place announced rescue, but rain no longer entered through the freight room seam. The front threshold closed against weather. 2 soft floorboards had been braced from below by a county maintenance crew after Nora marked them correctly 3 weeks in a row. The ticket counter had been cleaned with mild soap and patience not sanded into forgetting. The rate board remained slightly forward from the wall, its hidden cavity photographed and protected behind a clear panel Mr. Bell insisted was temporary until proper funding appeared. Nora learned the habits of the building. Morning damp gathered first under the north window. Wind from the inlet made the dock bell speak only when the tide turned. The front door needed to be lifted before the latch would catch. If she opened the office too quickly after a cold night, the room gave out a sealed smell of salt, old paper, and cypress, as if the past required a minute before company. She worked 3 mornings a week for June and 2 afternoons for Mr. Bell, copying ledger entries into a county database that crashed whenever the Wi-Fi weakened. The pay was modest. The storage room above the bait shop became less temporary by degrees. A clean sheet on the cot. A crate turned into a nightstand, a chipped mug by the sink, her folded photograph of her mother tucked into the mirror frame. No one called it a fresh start. Nora was grateful for that. Fresh starts sounded like wiping a surface clean. This was more like drying wet wood slow, uneven, requiring air and time. The ledger itself went to the county archive for stabilization. Mr. Bell brought back approved copies in sleeves and 1 small display case with a humidity card tucked discreetly in the corner. The brass tokens did not go on display at first. Nora argued quietly but firmly that showing every object too soon would turn private mercy into spectacle. Mr. Bell looked at her over his glasses and said, "That is a defensible interpretation." From him, it felt like applause. They chose 3 copied pages for the front room. 1 explained fares. 1 showed storm crossings. 1 held Clara Wren's name. Beneath it, Nora wrote a label. After 6 drafts, some crossings were recorded not as debts but as passages given in hard weather. June read it and nodded. "Doesn't chew the food for people." Nora smiled. "I tried not to." A week before Christmas, Mr. Bell called the bait shop while Nora was restocking coffee filters. He had found a living Wren family 2 towns over, connected through church records and a birth certificate that listed Clara as mother to a son born in 1951. Nora felt a strange protectiveness rise in her, as if the name on the wall had become someone resting in the next room. "No public announcement," she said. "I did not suggest one. Not a big reveal, not cameras." Nora, Mr. Bell said, dry as paper. "My idea of excitement is a correctly labeled folder." So she wrote a letter by hand before typing the clean version. She included a copy of the ledger, a photograph of the tide mark, and an invitation to visit if they wished. She did not say they should be proud. She did not say Amos was a hero. She wrote only what could be supported. Clara. Wren's name appears in a private ferry ledger at Brackett's Landing. The note indicates she was carried during a medicine run. The record was hidden to keep unpaid crossings from public posting. The answer came 10 days later in a cream envelope addressed to the bait shop. Clara's granddaughter was named Elise Ward. She was 68, retired from the school cafeteria, and remembered hearing that her grandmother had once crossed the inlet in weather so bad the ferry keeper wrapped the baby in his own coat. She had thought it was a family story made larger by retelling. Elise arrived on a cold, clear morning with her daughter and a paper sack of biscuits because, as June said later, some people understood history better than committees did. She was small, sharp-eyed, and quiet. Nora met her at the gravel track, suddenly aware of her muddy boots and the wind pulling loose hair from her braid. "I'm Nora," she said. "I know," Elise answered. "You wrote carefully." Inside the ferry office, Elise did not cry in the way Nora had feared and half expected. She stood before the copied ledger page for a long time. Then she moved to the wall behind the ticket counter where Clara's penciled name had been cleaned and protected beneath a thin sheet of clear acrylic. Elise lifted her hand but did not touch the surface. My daddy said she hated owing, Elise said. Would walk hungry before asking twice. Nora thought of the half granola bar folded in its wrapper of turning off her phone rather than becoming another call for help. The ledger says Amos didn't count it that way. No, Elise said. I suppose he didn't. They walked to the rear window where the tide board could be seen beside the steps. The inlet lay bright under winter sun water wrinkled by wind. Nora explained the marks, the pegs, the tokens. The way the hidden cavity opened only when the waterline order was respected. Elise listened without interrupting. At the door before leaving, Elise took one biscuit from the paper sack and set it on the ticket counter wrapped in a napkin. For whoever forgets lunch, she said. June, who had been pretending not to hover, turned toward the window. The 90-day delay became 6 months after the archive assessment. 6 months became a small preservation grant matched by local labor and a county line item too modest for anyone to fight over. The dock was not rebuilt for passengers. Its first section was made safe enough to show where the crossing had begun, and the rest remained closed, silvered by weather, and honest about its danger. The freight shed became storage for maintenance tools and storm shutters. The front room became the Brackett's Landing Ferry Archive, open Saturdays, when weather allowed, and by appointment when it did not. Nora's title never sounded grand. Caretaker Assistant, Archive Aide, Seasonal Site Contact. She kept all three printed on one badge because the county liked categories, and she had stopped minding the lack of a single name for useful work. Sometimes visitors came expecting treasure. They glanced at the rate board, the ledger copies the brass tokens displayed only after Elise gave permission for Clara's initials to be shown. They asked what the hidden packet was worth. Nora would look toward the inlet before answering, giving them a chance to notice the distance between banks. It depends what you think passage is worth, she would say. Most understood after that. Some did not. The building was patient with both kinds. On the first warm day of March, Nora received a forwarded envelope from Mrs. Alvarez, her former caseworker. Inside was a short note in familiar blocky handwriting. I heard you found work near the river. I'm glad you are somewhere with the door that closes. Nora stood behind the ferry counter reading that line 3 times. Then she unlocked the display case and placed a new archival card beside the copy of the March 1954 ledger page. Joseph Vale remained only a possible thread, no more and no less. The card did not claim kinship. It read, "Some names may lead to family history. Some simply show that help traveled farther than memory." That was enough. By then, her room above the bait shop had a small lamp, 2 shelves, and a plant. June insisted was impossible to kill. Nora still had days when fear returned without permission. A late bill, a form she did not understand, a county email with too many attachments. But fear no longer proved she was alone. There were keys on her ring now, bait shop back. One Saturday near the end of winter, Nora walked down the gravel track before sunrise to open the office. The air smelled of pine smoke from houses inland and salt from the inlet. Frost silvered the grass around the ferry sign. She lifted the door as she turned the key just the way the old latch required and stepped inside. The room held the dim blue light before morning. The counter waited. The tide marks crossed the wall in their measured order. Clara Wren's name rested beneath its clear cover, not hidden, now not exposed cruelly either, remembered with care. Nora set her duffel behind the counter, the same canvas bag she had carried through rain months before. It no longer. She opened the rear shutter. Across the inlet, the first line of sun touched the water and turned it pale gold. The dock bell moved, once silent at first, then rang in a rough, salt-worn note as the wind came up over the river. Nora unlocked the front door and left it open.